Hello, Proponomics people, and welcome to the longer form macro blast from Tuesday, the 12th of March, 2024. So I just wanted to go through what's been released this morning, which is that time of the month where we get the Office for National Statistics figures on unemployment and, more crucially these days, employment, actually, because we have so much inactivity in the workforce. So I've got to preface this by saying, apart from anything else, we're struggling a little bit at the moment with the unemployment figures and the veracity and the truth of them. And this isn't only a UK thing. Everything's being revised. Unfortunately, being a government department, we've been told we've got to wait till September until we get the new figures through. And of course, a bit of the fear is that it's painting a rosy picture that's not really there at the moment. But what you really have to do is look out there in the bigger and wider economy and see, are people losing their jobs? We're in the privileged position of running a larger portfolio. Now, of course, our tenants don't necessarily tell us when they've lost their jobs, but we do sometimes see when monies are coming from universal credit, of course, apart from anything else. And we're not seeing mass and widespread unemployment by any stretch of the imagination yet. In fact, we're not seeing any evidence of it. Then you look at you look at your peer network on the ground and who you're talking to, who's around you, and decide whether they've got major league job problems. What we're seeing, and we have been seeing for some time, is more recruitment freezes, so people stopping hiring. There's this fear that companies have been hoarding labour. It's quite a British thing to do because it's not easy to get people, especially good people, and you don't want to lose them. And even if business is a bit quieter, you try not to lose them. But in reality, when they become much, much more expensive, that is harder. And of course, companies have needed people. And of course, now very recently, there's been some tweaks to those immigration rules to make it less attractive for people to come in. And of course, all those migrants who have come in over the past couple of years have, generally speaking, been filling jobs, apart from anything else, because that's why they've been coming to the United Kingdom, and that's why companies have wanted them to come to the United Kingdom, apart from anything else. That's cooled off a bit as well on the back of that. But you've got potential job hopping, although not that likely at the moment, because there is this fear of a bit of a difficult environment. Certainly in the consumers, they're saving quite a lot of money and they're concerned that now might not be the time to switch jobs. And I'd say they're probably right, to be honest with you. They may as well be hoarded, or they may as well try and make themselves useful, or possibly switch across roles in a company. We've certainly had that happen within our group where people have offered to pitch in and do something else because they've known their particular function has been quiet. That's sort of looking backwards over the past 12 to 18 months. We're through that now and we're busy, and that's no problem, but that's only a very small anecdotal example, of course, because there's quite a small number of staff in my overall operations. So I prefer to look at the employment rate rather than unemployment. Unemployment went from 3.8 to 3.9. That's the headline. Still very low. Below 4 is below where almost everybody expected it to be by now. It's incredible that the market is holding up that well at under 4%. But of course, there is this growing inactivity piece. So we're talking 21.1% economically inactive and 75% employed. Now, this is 16 to 65 we look at. That's the Office for National Statistics, even though I know what you're going to say, pension doesn't start till 67 these days. And you'd be right, but it's the way they've done it for years. And it's the way I think that they're going to continue to do it for some time until the next bump up in the pension age, which, by the way, is absolutely inevitable and absolutely needs to be done for the good of the national finances. As soon as anyone's brave enough to take that on, which is not going to happen before an election, of course, or no one's going to tell you about it before an election anyway, 75% is the figure we're watching. 76.2 was that number before the pandemic, and that really is the yardstick. We had 76.2% employed. Now we're down to 75. We've also got a couple of hours a week on average lower. Less work being done by full-time employees. So we're about 33 hours for the average full-time employee, which I'm sure many people would argue is not really full-time hours, but there we go. Now, some of that, of course, comes down to the fact that some companies have been doing 4-day weeks and things like that. And, 30 hours of supremely productive activity and happy staff, I would argue, is definitely better than 40 hours of unproductive, quiet quitters and all the rest of it. Of course it is. But sometimes those things are a bit idealistic. It kind of depends what industry you work in, I think. And all the, dynamic people I've known are not people who sit and watch the clock in terms of what they're doing. They're working as long and as hard as they need to get things done. They don't moan about it. They get on with it. Working from home has saved them a lot of time in terms of commuting, and they don't mind putting some of that time back into the job that they're doing. So the COVID measurement of the labour market, or measurement since COVID, has been problematic, and that's really why the ONS are saying they need to revise their figures. That's another point they make in their report today. We've got 21,000 fewer people employed than the last 3-month period, but 76,000 more year on year. That's where we are at the moment. 33,175,000 people employed at the employment rate of 75%, as I say, in the 16 to 64 age category. Unemployment actually in numbers 1.36 million, so significant. But if you remember back to the 80s when we were 2 million plus unemployed and population was a lot smaller, we were knocking on 3 million unemployed actually, if I recall correctly. Bit different there apart from anything else. But as I say, that inactivity rate is what people are watching. Total weekly hours are measured and they are in the millions. And so 1,057,000,000 hours are worked every week in the UK. And that actually is up over the last 12 months by 14.7 million. But of course, with 76,000 more people employed, you'd expect that to go up. Is the average up? Not so sure about that. And then redundancies are always worthwhile looking at. There's been 133,000 over the past 12 months, which is 71,000 more than the 3-month period before. So we are seeing more redundancies, and that will start to unnerve people a little bit, I'm sure. It's framed as 133,000 plus or minus 33,000. They do give a confidence interval for that. But yeah, year on year, 40,000 more. 3-month on 3-month, 71,000 more. So fairly significant redundancies are happening in some number. This is, a general way of which you tend to head towards an economic contraction is you start with hiring freezes, starting at the very biggest companies. So they're not taking anyone on. Organically, people leave. Of course they do. They retire. They do all the rest of that sort of stuff. And then you go to redundancies. And that's when things start to heat up a little bit. Is 133,000 enough to get incredibly worried when you've got 33.175 million people employed? No, it's not realistically, is it? It's about 1/6 of a million in 33 million. So you're talking 1 in 200 people being made redundant. It's not going to make a huge ripple in the unemployment market. But the trend is what people tend to watch, and the trend ultimately is going upwards. So employment rates, obviously, generally speaking, higher in men than women because it's still women that have the babies, even in a world that's trying to move towards equality of opportunity more and more in the workplace. The number of people with second jobs is also falling and has been falling for a while. This is a sign that tracks back to my point that worst bits of the cost of living crisis are over. Household-wise, as a household, we're out of it. As a per person per household measurement, we're not completely out of it yet, but we've definitely seen the bottom. And of course, we've still got, most importantly, wages moving upwards. So 5.6%, including bonuses year on year. And remember, there was a lot of one-off bonuses that went on thanks to COVID. So a lot of people in public sector, certainly included, said, look, COVID was really tough. The reality is they didn't want to give a permanent pay rise because of COVID. But then there also is an element of equity there, isn't there? Because ultimately, if people had to work a lot harder or in much tougher conditions or all the rest of those things that many people did, key workers, during COVID, then one-off event, one-off bonus makes sense. Should have been given without fighting, in my opinion. That was the political mistake that was made. It was well deserved. It definitely would have had the country's support. And the numbers we're talking about are not so ridiculous as to upset any apple carts. Less than we wasted during COVID by a fraction of 100 of what we wasted, let's face it. So definitely fair and good political business there, it would have been. So it's best at the moment to look at the average earnings excluding the bonus. And that's only nibbled down from 6.2% to 6.1%. So it hasn't made a gigantic amount of pressure of movement towards the downside. Now, the consensus was 6.2, so it's nibbled in just under consensus. So that's slightly positive, I suppose. There was thoughts that it might not move anywhere, but I mean, I don't know how much you can take in terms of 0.1. It is moving downwards. The trend has been downwards over the last 6 or 7 months. And then we look at other things like claimant count changes. How many more people claiming? 17 million more people claiming, 17,000, people claiming unemployment benefit.